17,000 feet above sea level on a ridge where the air holds barely half the oxygen your lungs are used to. There is a pass that almost no civilian has ever stood on. It has no town nearby, no road sign marks it. You cannot book a permit to visit it, no matter how much you are willing to pay. Soldiers patrol it in silence, in temperatures that fall below -30. On a border that neither of the two countries claiming it has ever agreed to draw on the same map. This is Kongka, and for most of the world, it doesn't exist. You have probably heard of line of actual control, the informal, unmarked boundaries that separates Indian and Chinese territory across the Himalayas. You may have heard of Galwan Valley, where soldiers clashed with rocks, clubs, and their bare hands in 2020, and where the two most populous nations on earth came closer to open war than at any point in decades. But before Galwan, before the 1962 war that reshaped the balance of power in Asia, there was Kongka. And what happened there in October of 1959 is the reason this stretch of frozen nowhere still matters today. The official story, the one told in the most textbook, is simple. India and China share a long, difficult, largely uninhabited border. Disputes flare up occasionally, diplomats manage them. Soldiers on both sides exercise restraint. It is, we are told, a stable if uneasy peace, punctured by a rare and regrettable incidents. But when you look closer at what actually happened at Kongka, that story starts to fracture, because this wasn't a rare incident. It was the moment the two nations realized they were already at war, and neither one had said so out loud. To understand why, you need to go back to a piece of land that almost nobody outside the region had heard of before the 1950s, Aksai Chin. Aksai Chin is a high-altitude desert, a vast, barren plateau wedged between Tibet and Ladakh. It has almost no permanent population, almost no vegetation, and for most of the history, no strategic value to anyone. That changed after 1950, when Chinese forces moved into the Tibet and began consolidating control over the region. Suddenly, the People's Republic of China needed a reliable route connecting Tibet in the east to Xinjiang in the west, its two most restive frontier provinces. The most direct path ran straight through Aksai Chin. There was just one problem. India considered Aksai Chin part of its own territory, inherited from the British colonial era maps that were themselves vague, contested, and in some cases drawn by surveyors who had never actually set foot on the ground they were mapping. China built the road anyway, Highway 219, cutting directly across the plateau, connecting Tibet to Xinjiang. India didn't even learn the road existed until 1957, when it appeared already completed on a Chinese map. Nehru's government was stunned. A 400-kilometer highway had been constructed through territory India claimed as its own, and India had not noticed until it was finished. What followed was a slow, grinding escalation that most people today have never heard of. India began sending small police and paramilitary patrols into the disputed high-altitude zones, establishing forward posts to assert its claim. This became known as the forward policy. Plant a flag, hold a position, force the other side to either back down or confront you directly. It was a strategy built on the assumption that China, still consolidating its hold on Tibet and wary of provoking a larger conflict, would not risk an armed clash over empty, frozen ground. That assumption was about to be tested at a pass called Kongka. In October 1959, India's Ministry of Home Affairs ordered a detachment of Central Reserve Police Force, roughly 70 men, to establish a series of forward outposts in the Changchemo Valley. Their objective was La Lakna Pass, a pass India regarded as its rightful border. To get there, the patrol had to pass through Kongka Pass first. The men were led by a deputy superintendent of police named Karan Singh. According to Indian accounts, Singh's patrol had no idea what was waiting for them. As they approached the pass, they walked directly into a fully equipped detachment of Chinese People's Liberation Army soldiers. Already dug in, already holding the high ground. What happened next entirely depends on who you ask. And that perhaps is the first real crack in the official story. Even the two governments most directly involved cannot agree on what took place over those 2 days. The Indian government's account, published soon after in an official white paper, describes an unprovoked ambush. 3 Indian policemen were captured and detained on October 20th. The following day, the remaining patrol was reportedly fired upon from higher ground. In what Indian officials characterized as a deliberate, prepared assault rather than a defensive skirmish, 9 Indian policemen were killed. 10 more, including Karam Singh himself, were taken as prisoner and marched to a Chinese camp near Rudok, where they were interrogated before eventual release weeks after. China's account is almost a mirror image. Chinese officials maintained that the Indian patrol had crossed roughly 10 kilometers into territory Beijing considered its own, that warning were issued, and that Chinese forces opened fire only after the Indian patrol allegedly fired first. In this version, it is India's forward policy, not the Chinese aggression, that triggered the bloodshed. Chinese sources acknowledged only a single casualty of their own, 2 governments, 2 irreconcilable accounts. 9 dead men whose family received one version of events, filtered entirely through the political needs of the state that employed them. This is where the story most people know ends. A tragic border skirmish quickly folded into the broader narrative of the 1962 war that would follow 3 years later, a footnote. But look closer, the significance of Kongka Pass becomes much harder to dismiss. Because this wasn't simply a clash between two patrols who stumbled into each other by accident. India's own internal deliberation, later reconstructed by historians, show that Prime Minister Nehru had explicitly warned against sending forward patrols into Kongka Pass area just weeks earlier. Worried about exactly this kind of confrontation, the Home Ministry sent the patrol anyway. Which raises an uncomfortable question that official histories rarely linger on. Why did a democratic government, warned in advance of the risk, proceed regardless? Was it a miscommunication between ministries, overconfidence in China's restraint, or a calculated gamble? One that assumed Beijing would back down rather than fire on unarmed police. Whatever the answer, the gamble failed catastrophically, and the aftermath reshaped the entire relationship between the two nations. Within India, the incident triggered a wave of public outrage. Newspapers described it using the language of massacre, not skirmish. Parliament, previously indifferent to remote border question, suddenly demanded answers. The event hardened public opinion against any negotiated settlement with China, making compromise politically toxic for years to come. Right up through the catastrophic war of 1962, where India, still operating on the same forward policy assumption, found itself decisively outmatched. Within China, the incident became part of a broader narrative of defending sovereign territory against what Beijing characterized as Indian encroachment, a framing that continues to shape Chinese statements on border dispute to this day. And Konkla itself never became peaceful again. It remains right now one of the most militarized and least accessible point on earth. Both India and China maintain permanent outposts near the pass. Civilian access is prohibited on both sides. Satellite imageries over the decades have shown a slow, steady buildup of infrastructure, roads, barracks, and communication towers on both sides of a boundary that still, more than 60 years later, has never been formally agreed upon. This matters far beyond the history books because the pattern set at Kongka in this 1959 is the same pattern that produced Galwan Valley in 2020. Ambiguous borders, forward patrol, testing each other's resolve. Two nuclear-armed nations relying on unwritten rules of restraint that can break down in minutes. At altitude where single miscalculation costs lives before anyone in either capital even knows a confrontation has begun. What is often overlooked in the discussion of India-China relation is how much of it still runs through the terrain almost identical to Konkala. Unmapped, unpopulated, and strategically vital precisely because no one lives there to witness what happens. The line of actual control isn't a line at all. It's a series of competing perceptions, patrol routes, and claims, each side convinced its version is the true border. Each side willing, when pushed, to defend that conviction with force. 66 years after 9 policemen died on the ridge most of the world has never heard of, the same unresolved question still sits at the roof of Asia. Two nations, two nuclear arsenal, and a border that exists more as an argument than as a line on the ground. Konkala was never really about a pass in the Himalayas. It was the first proof that in places too remote and too cold for rest of the world to watch, history can turn on the decisions of 70 men who never expected to become the reason two countries stop trusting each other. The next confrontation, if it comes, may not happen at a place with a name you already know. It may happen at another Konkala, a ridge, a valley, a petrol route on a map that two governments never agreed to draw the same way, and when it does, the official story will likely sound just as simple as the one you were told about, this one. It rarely tells you what actually happened on the ground.